Hospital staff are astonished when a donkey barges in, seemingly on a mission. What this loyal animal does for its owner brings everyone to tears. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The small backyard on the outskirts of New York City stood unusually quiet that morning. Duke, a gray donkey with gentle eyes, stood motionless near the wooden fence, his ears twitching at every passing sound. The usual routine had been disrupted for weeks now. No more morning greetings, no more gentle pats on his neck, no more shared moments watching the sunrise. Jake's absence hung heavy in the air. Duke's hooves moved restlessly over the grass, creating shallow marks in the earth. The water in his trough remained untouched, and the fresh hay barely interested him. Mrs. Peterson, the elderly neighbor who had been checking on him daily, noticed his changed behavior. She'd seen many animals in her lifetime, but something about Duke's demeanor worried her. As the morning sun climbed higher, Duke's memories drifted to warmer days. Last summer, Jake had spent countless hours in this very yard, his easel set up under the old maple tree. The artist would talk to Duke while painting, sharing his dreams and ideas. Duke would stand nearby, occasionally nudging Jake's elbow, making him laugh and smear paint across his canvas. These weren't just moments of companionship. They were building blocks of trust and understanding. Jake had a way of talking to Duke that made the donkey feel understood. Unlike others who saw him as just another farm animal, Jake recognized the intelligence behind Duke's eyes. They developed their own language, a subtle mix of gestures, sounds, and silent understanding. When Jake was frustrated with a painting, Duke would gently pull at his sleeve, forcing him to take a break. When Duke felt restless, Jake would know exactly which spot behind his ears needed scratching. The accident hadn't happened in their yard. Duke hadn't witnessed it, but he felt the change in his world the moment Jake stopped coming. The regular rhythm of their days together had been replaced by an unsettling silence. The easel collected dust in the corner of the shed, and Jake's favorite bench remained empty. Something shifted in Duke that morning. Perhaps it was instinct, or maybe something deeper, a connection that transcended ordinary animal behavior. He moved toward the gate, pushing against it with his nose. The latch, worn from years of use, gave way easier than expected. Mrs. Peterson had always been careful to secure it, but today, fate had other plans. Duke stepped out of the yard for the first time in years. The bustling city stretched before him, a maze of concrete and steel so different from his peaceful backyard. Cars honked in the distance, and the rumble of the subway could be felt through the ground. Any other day, these urban sounds would have sent him retreating to his safe corner. But not today. With determination that seemed to come from somewhere beyond simple animal instinct, Duke took his first steps toward the city. He didn't know the exact location of the hospital. Animals don't understand such human concepts. But something pulled him forward, an invisible thread connecting him to Jake. People on the streets stopped and stared as the donkey walked past with purposeful steps. Some pulled out their phones to record the unusual sight, while others called animal control. But Duke moved with such certainty that few dared to approach him. His attention remained focused forward, guided by an inexplicable sense of direction. The morning traffic parted around him as he made his way deeper into the city. Duke's hooves clicked against the pavement, creating a rhythm that seemed to echo his determination. Each step took him closer to his destination, though he had no way of knowing exactly where that was. All he knew was that Anywhere in this concrete jungle, Jake needed him. New York Presbyterian Hospital's main entrance had seen many unusual visitors, but never a donkey. Duke arrived at the automatic glass doors, his coat dusty from the urban journey. Security guard Frank Martinez, a 20-year veteran of the hospital, reached for his radio before stopping mid-motion. Something about the animal's demeanor made him hesitate. The lobby fell silent. Visitors froze in their tracks, phones raised to capture the moment. Duke stood at the threshold, his breathing steady despite the long walk. The air conditioning ruffled his mane as the doors slid open, inviting him into the sterile environment. His hooves made soft clicking sounds against the polished floor as he stepped inside. Should we call animal control? a young receptionist whispered to Frank. The security guard raised his hand, signaling her to wait. In his 2 decades of service, he'd learned to trust his instincts. This didn't feel like a dangerous situation. Unusual, yes, but not threatening. Duke moved through the lobby with surprising grace for an animal his size. He navigated around chairs and potted plants as if he'd memorized the layout. The elevator doors opened, releasing a group of visitors who quickly pressed themselves against the walls. But Duke wasn't interested in the elevator. His attention turned toward the pediatric wing. Room 104 housed 7-year-old Emma Collins, who hadn't stopped crying since her latest round of chemotherapy. Her mother had tried everything: favorite books, videos, even her beloved stuffed animals. But nothing could comfort the child. The sound of Emma's sobs carried into the hallway, where Duke suddenly stopped. Without hesitation, the donkey turned and approached Emma's partially open door. Her crying paused momentarily as she noticed the long face peering into her room. Duke's ears twitched forward, and he made a soft, nickering sound, the same one he used to make when greeting Jake on particularly difficult days. "Mommy, look!" Emma's voice cracked with surprise. For the first time in days, her face showed something other than pain. Duke took this as an invitation and stepped fully into the doorway. The room was small, but he managed to maneuver carefully around the medical equipment. Emma's mother stood frozen, her hand hovering over the call button. But her daughter's expression stopped her from summoning the nurses. Emma had lifted her head from the pillow, eyes wide with wonder. Duke lowered his head to her bed level, maintaining a respectful distance while extending his nose toward her. The girl slowly reached out her hand, her line trailing behind her movement. When her fingers touched Duke's soft muzzle, a smile broke across her face. It was small at first, then grew wider as Duke gently nuzzled her palm. The simple interaction seemed to push back the shadows of her illness, if only for a moment. By now, a small crowd had gathered at the door. Nurses, doctors, and other patients watched in amazement as the donkey stood perfectly still, allowing Emma to pet his face. Her tears had stopped completely, replaced by a look of pure joy that seemed to brighten the entire room. Dr. Sarah Chun, head of pediatric oncology, pushed through the gathering crowd. She opened her mouth to object to the unauthorized visitor, but stopped when she saw Emma's transformation. In 15 years of practice, she'd never seen anything quite like this. The child who had been inconsolable just minutes ago was now sitting up, giggling as Duke's whiskers tickled her hand. After a few minutes with Emma, Duke stepped back, as if knowing it was time to move on. He turned toward the door, his mission in this room complete. The crowd parted automatically, creating a path for him in the hallway. As he walked away, Emma called out, "By donkey!" Her voice carried a strength that hadn't been there before. Duke continued his journey through the hospital corridors, his hooves now moving with renewed purpose. He passed more rooms, more surprised faces, more whispered conversations. Some patients pressed against their windows to catch a glimpse of him. Others called out, trying to draw his attention. But Duke remained focused, guided by whatever invisible force had brought him here. Nobody attempted to stop him. Perhaps they recognized that this was no ordinary event, no simple case of a lost animal wandering into the wrong place. Duke moved as if he knew exactly where he was going, even though such a thing should have been impossible. He was heading deeper into the hospital toward the rehabilitation wing, where Jake lay waiting, though Duke had no way of knowing this consciously. Room 415 in the rehabilitation wing was quiet except for the steady beeping of monitors. Jake Harrison lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling he'd memorized over the past 3 weeks. His once vibrant artist's hands rested motionless on the white sheets, fingers occasionally twitching, a cruel reminder of what he'd lost. The accident had taken more than his mobility. It had stolen his spirit, the creative energy that once flowed through him like electricity. His sketchbook lay untouched on the bedside table, its pages blank, a visual representation of the void he felt inside. The doctor spoke of progress, of small improvements, but Jake had stopped listening days ago. Sunlight filtered through half-drawn blinds, creating patterns on the floor that would have once inspired him to paint. Now they only served as a reminder of the world continuing without him. Physical therapy sessions had become exercises in frustration, each small failure feeding the darkness that had settled over him like a heavy blanket. Dr. Martinez had just finished his morning rounds, leaving Jake with the usual encouragement about taking things one day at a time. The words felt hollow, like everything else. The accident had left him with partial paralysis on his right side, his painting hand. Though the doctors assured him it was temporary, each passing day made that promise feel more distant. The corridor outside his room had been unusually busy this morning. Fragments of excited conversations drifted through his door, but Jake remained disconnected from the commotion. His world had shrunk to the dimensions of his hospital room, a self-imposed isolation that felt safer than facing reality. Then came the sound, different from the usual hospital noise. The distinct click of something hard against the floor tiles. Jake's artist's ear, trained to notice details, picked up the rhythm. It wasn't the squeak of nurses' shoes or the roll of medical equipment. This sound was organic, purposeful. The footsteps grew closer. Jake's heart rate monitor picked up slightly, though he couldn't explain why. There was something familiar about that sound, something that tugged at memories he'd been trying to suppress. His head turned toward the door, the first voluntary movement he'd made in hours. A shadow appeared in the doorway, larger than a person's. Jake blinked, certain his mind was playing tricks on him. But the shape remained, and then moved forward into the light. The impossible had happened. Duke stood in his hospital room, ears forward, eyes fixed directly on Jake. Time seemed to stop. The monitor's beeping faded into background noise. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he stared at his friend, his companion, the being he'd thought he might never see again. Duke's coat was dusty, evidence of his journey through the city, but his eyes held the same gentle intelligence Jake remembered. "Duke!" Jake's voice cracked, unused for days except for necessary responses to medical staff. The donkey's ears twitched at the sound of his name, and he moved forward with careful steps. The medical equipment didn't faze him. He navigated around 4 stands and monitors as if they were the familiar obstacles of their backyard. When Duke reached the bedside, he lowered his head slowly. His nose touched Jake's left hand, the one that still had full feeling. The touch was gentle, warm, familiar. It was the same greeting they'd shared hundreds of times before, but here, in this sterile hospital room, it felt like a miracle. Tears began to roll down Jake's cheeks. Not the tears of frustration and despair he'd shed in physical therapy, but something different. Tears that carried hope within their salt. Duke remained still, his presence solid and real, grounding Jake in the moment in a way no medicine had managed to do. A nurse appeared in the doorway, presumably drawn by the unusual situation. She started to speak, to object, but fell silent at the scene before her. There was something sacred in this moment, something that transcended hospital protocols and regulations. Jake's right hand, the one that had refused to cooperate in therapy, twitched, then slowly lifted. The movement was small, barely noticeable to anyone else, but to Jake it felt monumental. Duke shifted slightly, bringing his head within reach of those struggling fingers. When they made contact with his soft muzzle, Jake felt a surge of something he'd almost forgotten, possibility. The reunion wasn't just about comfort or companionship. As Duke stood there, patient and present, something began to shift in Jake's mind. The darkness that had enveloped him started to recede, pushed back by the simple, powerful reality of his friend's presence. This wasn't just a visit. It was a reminder that some connections transcend circumstance, that love finds its way through any barrier. The atmosphere in room 415 shifted as Jake's hand remained on Duke's muzzle. Something stirred within him, a forgotten strength, a buried determination. His gaze moved from Duke to the edge of the bed, measuring the distance with newfound purpose. The challenge that had seemed insurmountable just minutes ago now felt like a necessary step. "I need to get up," Jake whispered, more to himself than anyone else. The nurse in the doorway, Amanda Chun, stepped forward instinctively. She'd been working with rehabilitation patients for 12 years, and every instinct told her to stop him. But something in Jake's expression made her pause. Jake's arms trembled as he pressed them against the mattress. His right side, weakened by the accident, protested the movement. Previous attempts at sitting up had ended in frustration and exhaustion. But this time was different. Duke remained perfectly still beside the bed, his presence like an anchor in a storm. The monitoring equipment began beeping faster as Jake's heart rate increased with effort. A small crowd had gathered at the door. Other nurses, a physical therapist, and several patients from nearby rooms who'd followed Duke's trail. They watched in silence as Jake fought against his own limitations. His first attempt to push himself up ended in a grimace of pain. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his arms shook with exertion. Duke made a soft, nickering sound, the same sound he used to make when encouraging Jake to try one more brushstroke on a difficult painting. The familiar gesture sparked something in Jake's memory, the countless times he'd pushed through creative blocks with Duke by his side. "I can do this," Jake muttered through clenched teeth. His second attempt brought him a few inches higher. The physical therapist, Dr. Sarah Matthews, stepped into the room but didn't interfere. She recognized this moment for what it was, a breakthrough that no amount of planned therapy could have engineered. Duke shifted his position slightly, moving closer to the bed. The movement was subtle but deliberate, placing his sturdy frame within Jake's reach. It was as if the donkey understood exactly what his friend needed, not just emotional support, but physical presence. Jake's left hand grabbed the bed rail while his right hand, the one that had barely responded to therapy, reached for Duke's neck. His fingers tangled in the coarse mane, finding strength in the familiar texture. With a grunt of effort, he pulled himself into a sitting position. The room collectively held its breath. Jake hadn't managed to sit up unassisted since the accident. His doctors had estimated it would take weeks more of therapy to reach this point. Yet here he was upright, with his hand still gripping Duke's mane. Amanda stepped forward, ready to support him if needed, but Jake shook his head. "Wait," he said, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. His legs shifted under the blanket as he turned toward the edge of the bed. Duke remained motionless, becoming a living support beam for his friend. The next few moments seemed to stretch into eternity. Jake's feet touched the cold floor, his hospital gown falling around his knees. His legs trembled with the effort of bearing weight, muscles weakened by weeks of disuse. But he didn't fall. Between the bed rail and Duke's solid presence, he found enough support to stand. Tears streamed down Amanda's face as she watched. In the doorway, Dr. Matthews was already mentally rewriting Jake's therapy schedule, recognizing that all her previous assessments needed revision. The gathered crowd remained silent, witnessing something that felt bigger than a simple physical achievement. Jake stood for nearly a minute, his breath coming in sharp gasps, his hand never leaving Duke's neck. When his legs finally began to buckle, both Amanda and Dr. Matthews rushed forward to help him back into bed. But the victory had been claimed, an impossible moment made possible by the presence of an unlikely therapist. As Jake settled back against his pillows, exhausted but triumphant, Duke gently nuzzled his hand again. The simple gesture carried volumes of meaning, pride, encouragement, and unconditional support. The room had fallen silent except for the steady beeping of monitors, but the air was charged with emotion. Dr. Matthews pulled out her tablet, making rapid notes. This wasn't just a milestone in Jake's recovery. It was a moment that challenged everything she thought she knew about rehabilitation. The connection between human and animal had accomplished in minutes what weeks of conventional therapy hadn't managed. Over the next few weeks, Room 415 transformed from a place of isolation into a hub of activity. The calendar on Jake's wall filled with appointments, but they weren't just physical therapy sessions anymore. Each day had a designated Duke time marked in bold letters, turning routine rehabilitation into something patients and staff alike looked forward to. Duke's daily arrivals became a hospital ritual. Mrs. Peterson, understanding the importance of these visits, would walk him to the hospital entrance each morning, where security guard Frank Martinez would greet them with a special visitor's badge he'd created just for Duke. The badge, hanging from Duke's halter, read Therapy Assistant in Training. Jake's recovery accelerated at a pace that bewildered his medical team. The same hands that had struggled to hold a spoon now gripped therapy bands with determination. His right side, though still weaker, showed remarkable improvement. Duke stood beside him during exercises, providing both physical support and motivation. When Jake's strength wavered, one look at his friend's steady presence would push him to try one more repetition. Sarah Chun, the nurse who had witnessed Jake's first steps with Duke, saw an opportunity bigger than one patient's recovery. During her lunch breaks, she began researching animal-assisted therapy programs. Her desk accumulated studies and papers, data supporting what she witnessed daily in room 415. "We could help so many more patients," Sarah explained to Dr. Matthews one afternoon, spreading documents across the break room table. "Duke's not just helping Jake. He's changing the entire floor's atmosphere. Did you notice how Mr. Rodriguez in 417 stopped refusing his medication since Duke started visiting?" The impact was undeniable. Patients emerged from their rooms when they heard Duke's hooves in the hallway. The pediatric ward requested visits after hearing about Emma's transformation. Even the typically stoic Dr. Harrison found himself making detours past room 415 to watch the unlikely pair during therapy sessions. Jake's artistic instincts began to resurface. His hands, growing stronger each day, started reaching for his sketchbook again. The first drawings were shaky, simple lines and shapes that frustrated him. But Duke would nudge his elbow, just like in their backyard days, until Jake's perfectionism gave way to patience. "It's not just about physical recovery," Jake explained to Sarah during one of their sessions. "Duke reminds me who I was, who I still am, beyond the accident. When he's here, I'm not just a patient. I'm his friend, his companion. It changes everything." His words became the cornerstone of Sarah's proposal for a formal animal therapy program. The hospital administration initially met the idea with skepticism. Insurance concerns, hygiene protocols, and liability issues created a wall of bureaucratic resistance. But Sarah had compiled her case meticulously. She presented photos, progress reports, and testimonials from patients and staff. The dramatic improvement in recovery times and patient morale spoke volumes. Duke's presence had already unofficially expanded beyond Jake's sessions. He seemed to know which patients needed him most on any given day. He'd stop by room 422, where an elderly man battled depression after a stroke, or visit the children's ward, where his gentle demeanor brought smiles to tired faces. Dr. Matthews documented everything. Her medical reports began including notes about animal interaction benefits and emotional support correlation with physical improvement. The data backed what everyone on the floor already knew. Something extraordinary was happening, something that couldn't be explained by traditional medical metrics alone. One morning, Sarah arrived early to find Jake sitting in a chair by his window sketching. Duke stood nearby, periodically checking the drawing's progress. The scene captured everything she'd been trying to convey to the administration: the natural healing power of animal companionship, the way it bridged the gap between medical treatment and human connection. "We need to make this official," she declared, watching Jake add details to his sketch with increasingly steady hands. "Not just for you and Duke, but for everyone who needs this kind of healing." Jake looked up from his drawing, his eyes clear and focused, a stark contrast to the defeated patient she'd first met weeks ago. The proposal Sarah drafted went beyond simple animal visits. She envisioned a comprehensive program: scheduled therapy sessions, trained animal companions, documented outcomes. Duke had shown them the potential. Now it was time to build something lasting from his spontaneous act of devotion. As she finalized the paperwork, Sarah heard laughter from Jake's room. Real, genuine laughter that echoed down the hospital corridor. It was the sound of healing, of hope returning. Duke had started something remarkable, and she was determined to ensure his legacy would help others find their way back to themselves, just as Jake had. The first official animal therapy session was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. Duke arrived wearing a new blue vest with "Therapy Animal" embroidered in white letters, a far cry from his original unauthorized hospital entrance. The vest had been Sarah's idea, a symbol of legitimacy that helped ease the administration's concerns about professionalism. Room 301 housed Margaret Wilson, an 82-year-old former concert pianist who hadn't spoken since her stroke 3 weeks ago. Her family had tried everything: photo albums, favorite, e-music, even bringing her beloved piano books. But Margaret remained locked in silence, her once expressive face blank, her hands motionless in her lap. Sarah led Duke into the room, while Jake watched from his wheelchair in the doorway. This was their first official session, and despite the administration's approval, everyone felt the weight of proving the program's worth. Duke seemed to sense the importance of the moment, walking with measured steps toward Margaret's bed. The elderly woman didn't react at first, her gaze fixed on the window. But as Duke drew closer, something shifted in her expression, subtle, almost imperceptible. Her fingers, which hadn't moved voluntarily since the stroke, twitched slightly on the blanket. "Mrs. Wilson," Sarah spoke softly. "This is Duke. Would you like to say hello?" There was no verbal response, but Margaret's eyes moved from the window to the donkey, standing patiently beside her bed. Duke lowered his head slowly, his movements gentle and deliberate, until his nose was within reach of her hand. The room fell silent. Jake leaned forward in his wheelchair, recognizing the moment for what it was, a bridge being built between isolation and connection. Margaret's right hand lifted slightly off the blanket, trembling with effort. When her fingers made contact with Duke's soft muzzle, tears began rolling down her cheeks. "Piano," she whispered, her voice rough from weeks of disuse. The words seemed to surprise even her. Sarah quickly grabbed her notepad, documenting the moment, while Jake wheeled himself closer to the bed. Margaret's fingers moved across Duke's nose in a familiar pattern, the same way they had once moved across piano keys. "He feels like my old piano keys," Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger. "Warm in some places, cool in others." Each word seemed to break down another wall of silence. Duke remained perfectly still, allowing her touch to anchor her in the present moment. The session lasted 30 minutes, during which Margaret spoke more words than she had in the previous 3 weeks combined. She told Duke about her favorite piano pieces, about the concerts she used to perform, about the music she missed. Her hands grew more animated as she spoke, gesturing in ways her therapist had been trying to encourage for weeks. Word spread quickly through the hospital. By afternoon, Sarah's office had received calls from every department requesting Duke's services. The neurology ward wanted him for stroke patients. Pediatrics suggested weekly visits. Even the intensive care unit inquired about possible interactions with long-term patients. During the next session, Duke visited a teenage boy recovering from a car accident. The boy, angry and resistant to therapy, softened visibly when Duke pressed his head against the wheelchair. By the end of the visit, he had agreed to his next physical therapy session, something he'd been refusing for days. Sarah documented everything meticulously. Each reaction, each breakthrough, each moment of connection was recorded and analyzed. She noted how patients' vital signs stabilized in Duke's presence, how pain medication requests decreased during and after his visits, how the general atmosphere of the hospital shifted on days he was present. The most remarkable session that week involved a group therapy meeting in the hospital's common room. 6 patients, each dealing with different challenges, gathered around Duke. The usual barriers between them, age, condition, background, seemed to dissolve. They shared stories, offered encouragement, and found common ground in their interactions with the gentle donkey. Jake observed these sessions with growing emotion. Watching Duke work his magic with other patients helped him understand his own recovery differently. The connection he'd thought was unique to them was actually part of something larger, Duke's innate ability to reach past illness and injury to touch the man's spirit. He's not just a therapy animal, Jake explained to a visiting doctor who was observing the program. He's a reminder that healing isn't just about medicine and procedures. It's about maintaining our connections to each other, to hope, to the parts of ourselves we think we've lost. By week's end, the hospital board requested a formal presentation of the program's initial results. Sarah's data was impressive: improved patient compliance, accelerated recovery times, decreased anxiety levels. But the real impact was best seen in the small moments. A child's first smile after surgery, an elderly patient's renewed will to participate in therapy, a family's tears of joy at their loved one's progress. Duke had transformed from an unauthorized visitor to an essential part of the hospital's healing process. His presence in the halls became a symbol of hope, a living reminder that sometimes the most powerful medicine doesn't come in pills or procedures, but in the simple, profound connection between beings. The rehabilitation room's afternoon light fell across Jake's easel, a recent addition that had raised a few eyebrows among the hospital staff. Paint supplies weren't standard medical equipment, but Dr. Matthews had approved them as therapeutic tools. Between therapy sessions, the room had gradually transformed into an artist's studio, with sketchbooks and canvases sharing space with medical equipment. Jake's first attempts at painting since the accident had been frustrating. His right hand, still rebuilding its strength and coordination, struggled to achieve the precision he remembered. Brushes felt clumsy, colors refused to blend properly, and his initial works ended up in the wastebasket. But Duke, who had always been his most patient critic, would retrieve each discarded attempt and place it back on Jake's lap, refusing to let him give up. "Fine," Jake had muttered after the third rescued sketch. "We'll do it your way." That afternoon marked a turning point. Instead of fighting against his new limitations, Jake began adapting to them. He switched to larger brushes that required less precise control. His style evolved, becoming more impressionistic, more focused on capturing feeling than detail. The subject of his first successful painting was obvious. Duke standing in a hospital corridor, his silhouette backlit by fluorescent lights. Jake worked on it during his recovery breaks, adding layers of meaning with each session. The institutional setting transformed under his brush, the sterile hallway becoming almost magical, with Duke as its centerpiece. Sarah noticed the painting's progress during her rounds. "You're capturing how we all see him now," she observed, watching Jake add subtle touches to Duke's expression. "He's not just a donkey anymore. He's become something more." Jake nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Duke had transcended his role as a pet, or even a therapy animal. He'd become a symbol of hope for the entire hospital. Other patients began requesting visits to Jake's room, not just to see Duke, but to watch Jake paint. A young girl with rheumatoid arthritis sat quietly for hours, observing his adapted techniques for handling brushes with limited mobility. An elderly man recovering from a hand injury found inspiration in Jake's determination to create despite physical challenges. The painting took shape over weeks, growing deeper and more complex. Jake added subtle details that only hospital staff would recognize. The specific pattern of floor tiles outside the pediatric ward, the way light fell through the window near Margaret Wilson's room, the slight bend in the corridor where Duke always paused before visiting the children's wing. "It's not just about Duke," Jake explained to Dr. Matthews during a therapy session. "It's about what he represents, this incredible connection between healing and hope. Every time he walks these halls, he changes someone's story." Ash, his right hand, steadier now, made broad strokes across the canvas, capturing the warmth that Duke brought to the institutional setting. Word of the painting spread through the hospital. Staff members began taking detours past Jake's room to check its progress. The marketing department, hearing about the project, sent a representative to discuss using the image in hospital materials. But Jake had different ideas about the painting's future. "This isn't about publicity," he told them. "It's about remembering what happened here. What's still happening." His fingers traced the outline of Duke's form on the canvas. Some things can't be explained in medical charts or progress reports. Sometimes you need art to tell the whole story. The painting attracted the attention of local media when a nurse shared a photo on social media. A reporter from the New York Times requested an interview, interested in the unique story of an artist's recovery and the donkey that inspired it. Jake agreed, but only if they would focus on the broader impact of animal therapy rather than just his personal story. During the interview, Jake worked on the final details of the painting. The reporter watched in fascination as he added subtle highlights to Duke's eyes, capturing the intelligence and compassion that hospital staff had come to know so well. "Every great painting tells a truth," Jake explained. "This one tells the truth about healing, that it's not just about getting better physically. It's about finding your way back to who you are." The finished work was larger than Jake's previous paintings, nearly 4 feet wide. It showed Duke in perfect detail, but the hospital corridor around him seemed to shift and change depending on the viewer's perspective. Sometimes it looked exactly like the actual hallway. Other times it appeared more like a path leading somewhere mysterious and hopeful. "That's exactly right," Margaret Wilson said when she saw it, her pianist's hands gesturing expressively. "He leads us all somewhere different, but it's always somewhere better." Jake nodded, understanding that his painting had captured something essential about Duke's impact on the hospital. The way he created possibilities where there had seemed to be none. The painting became a conversation piece, drawing visitors from other departments and even other hospitals. But more importantly, it served as a daily reminder to everyone who passed by, patients, staff, and visitors alike, that healing takes many forms, and sometimes the most powerful medicine comes with for legs and gentle eyes. The New York Times reporter, Maria Chun, spent a full day following Duke and Jake through their hospital routine. Her notebook filled with observations. The way patients' faces lit up when they heard hoofbeats in the corridor, how Duke seemed to know instinctively which rooms needed him most, the subtle transformation of clinical interactions into moments of genuine connection. "What strikes me most," Maria noted during her interview with Jake, "is how this wasn't planned. No committee designed this program. It started with a donkey who simply refused to be separated from his friend. She watched as Jake adjusted himself in his wheelchair, now able to maintain his balance without assistance, a small but significant sign of his progress." The resulting article, titled "Hope on Four Legs: How One Donkey Revolutionized Hospital Therapy," appeared on the front page of the Sunday edition. Maria had captured the essence of what made Duke's story unique. It wasn't just about animal therapy or medical recovery. It was about the unexpected ways healing could happen when barriers between the clinical and the compassionate were broken down. The hospital's phone lines lit up the morning the article was published. Other medical facilities wanted information about starting similar programs. Animal rescue organizations offered partnerships. Researchers requested permission to study Duke's interactions with patients. The administration, initially skeptical of Sarah's program, now found themselves at the center of a healthcare innovation story. Dr. Matthews called an emergency meeting to address the sudden attention. "We need to do this right," she insisted, spreading proposals across the conference room table. "Duke showed us something important, but now we have to build on it responsibly." Sarah's carefully documented cases formed the foundation of their planning. The hospital board approved funding for a comprehensive animal therapy program, with Duke as its flagship member. But they wanted more than just occasional visits. They envisioned a full integration of animal therapy into their treatment protocols. The challenge was creating something structured enough to satisfy medical requirements while preserving the natural, unforced quality that made Duke's interactions so effective. "The key is understanding that Duke isn't just providing comfort," Jake explained during a planning session. "He's creating connections between patients and their will to recover, between staff and patients, between everyone and their hope for better days." His artist's perspective helped shape the program's philosophy, focusing on the human element rather than just medical outcomes. Sarah was appointed director of the new department, a position she accepted with one condition: that the program would remain accessible to all patients, regardless of their ability to pay. "Duke never asked to see anyone's insurance card," she pointed out. "He just knew who needed him." The fundraising event was organized for a Saturday afternoon in the hospital's garden courtyard. Patients who could leave their rooms gathered outside, while others watched from windows above. Jake's painting of Duke was displayed prominently, becoming a natural conversation piece that helped tell the story of how everything had started. Local businesses contributed to the cause, inspired by Duke's story. A pet supply company donated equipment for the therapy animals. A construction firm offered to renovate a hospital wing specifically for animal therapy sessions. Even the city council expressed interest in supporting the initiative, recognizing its potential impact on public health. During the event, Duke moved through the crowd with his usual gentle presence, pausing to greet familiar patients and charm potential donors. He seemed unchanged by his newfound celebrity, maintaining the same careful attention to each individual he encountered. Jake watched from nearby, noting how his friend's simple authenticity affected everyone around him. "The remarkable thing," Dr. Matthews told a group of visiting healthcare administrators, "is how this has changed our entire approach to healing. We're seeing improvements in areas we hadn't even considered. Patient compliance is up. Recovery times are shorter. Staff morale has improved significantly. The numbers supported her observations. Sarah presented data showing decreased anxiety levels in pre-surgery patients who spent time with therapy animals, reduced pain medication requests in the recovery ward, and improved participation in physical therapy sessions. But the most compelling evidence came from the patients themselves. Margaret Wilson, now regularly playing piano in the hospital's common room, shared how Duke had helped her find her voice again. Emma, the young cancer patient, talked about how visits from Duke gave her strength to face treatments. Each story added another layer to the program's foundation, proving that its success wasn't just about statistics. As the fundraising event concluded, the hospital announced its commitment to establishing the Duke Harrison Center for Animal-Assisted Therapy, named in honor of both the donkey who started it all and the artist whose recovery had helped prove its worth. The center would serve as both a treatment facility and a training GRU, ND for future therapy animals and their handlers. Jake watched the announcement from his usual spot near Duke, his hand resting on his friend's neck. The donkey's spontaneous act of love had grown into something neither of them could have imagined, creating a legacy that would continue to help others long after their own story became hospital legend. The fundraising event was winding down as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the hospital courtyard. Jake sat near his displayed painting, Duke standing faithfully by his side, when a man in a weathered denim jacket approached them. He moved slowly, his eyes fixed on Duke with an expression that made Jake's heart skip a beat. The stranger stopped a few feet away, his hands thrust deep in his pockets. "I've been following the story in the papers," he said quietly. "Saw the article about the therapy program. Never thought I'd find him here." His voice carried a mix of emotions that Jake couldn't quite read. Duke's ears perked forward, and his body language shifted subtly. Jake felt tension build in his chest as he watched his friend's reaction to the newcomer. The donkey took a step forward, giving a soft nickering sound that Jake had only ever heard him make for familiar faces. "My name's Michael Reeves," the man continued, finally meeting Jake's eyes. "And that's my donkey." The words fell like stones in still water, creating ripples of confusion and disbelief. Sarah, who had been nearby discussing the program with donors, moved closer, her clipboard clutched tightly against her chest. "There must be some mistake," Jake started, but Michael was already pulling out his phone, scrolling through old photos. He showed them images of a younger Duke on a small farm in New Jersey, wearing the same distinct marking around his left eye that Jake had painted countless times. "Lost him during a storm last spring," Michael explained, his voice rough with emotion. "Gate got damaged and he wandered off. Searched everywhere, put up posters, called every shelter in 3 counties. Never thought he'd make it all the way to the city." The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. All these months, he'd thought of Duke as a stray who had chosen him, who had somehow been meant to find him. The truth threatened to unravel everything. The bond they'd formed, the program they'd built, the healing they'd accomplished together. Hospital staff and patients gathered around, drawn by the tension in the air. Emma, holding her mother's hand, watched with wide, worried eyes. Margaret Wilson had stopped playing the piano in mid-song, her recovered voice silent as she observed the scene unfolding. "I have documentation," Michael said, pulling more papers from his jacket. "Registration, vet records, everything." His hands trembled slightly as he held out the documents. "I never stopped looking for him. He was more than just a farm animal to me. He was family." Jake felt the world tilting beneath him. His right hand, which had grown so much stronger through his work with Duke, gripped his wheelchair's armrest. The past months of recovery, connection, and purpose seemed to blur around the edges, threatening to dissolve into nothing more than a borrowed dream. Sarah stepped forward, her professional demeanor masking her own distress. "Mr. Reeves," she began, "Duke has become an essential part of our therapy program. He's helping dozens of patients recover, giving hope to people who had given up. Surely we can work something out?" But Michael's expression remained firm, though pained. "You don't understand," he said. "I raised him from a foal, bottle-fed him when his mother died. Every night for 5 years. He was the last thing I checked on before bed and the first thing I looked for in the morning. The courtyard had fallen completely silent. Even the usual city sounds seemed muted, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Duke stood between Jake and Michael, his head turning from one to the other, as if trying to bridge an impossible gap. Jake felt tears building behind his eyes, but refused to let them fall. He thought about all the moments Duke had given him strength, had helped him find his way back to himself. Now he needed to find strength on his own for what might be the hardest moment yet. "He's been a miracle for us," Jake said softly, reaching out to touch Duke's neck one more time. "But if he was yours first..." He couldn't finish the sentence. The words stuck in his throat, heavy with loss and resignation. Michael watched this interaction, his face a complex mixture of emotions. He saw the painting of Duke in the hospital corridor, saw the gathered patients whose lives had been touched by the donkey's presence, saw the obvious bond between the animal and the artist. The legal reality hung heavy in the air. Duke had an owner, and it wasn't Jake. All the progress, all the healing, all the hope that had built up around Duke's presence suddenly seemed fragile, balanced on the decision of a stranger who had every right to reclaim what was legally his. As the sun set over the hospital courtyard, casting long shadows across faces filled with concern and uncertainty, Jake realized that sometimes the hardest part of healing isn't the physical recovery. It's accepting that some things are beyond our control, even when they mean everything to us. Michael Reeves stood in the fading light of the hospital courtyard, his weathered hands running through Duke's mane. The gesture was familiar, practiced, the touch of someone who had spent years caring for the animal. Yet as he watched Duke lean slightly toward Jake, something shifted in his expression. "You know," Michael began, his voice softer now, "when I lost Duke, I spent months imagining where he might have ended up. I had nightmares about him scared and alone in the city." He paused, looking around at the gathering of patients, staff, and families. "Never once did I imagine this." Duke stood quietly between the two men, his presence bridging their worlds, the rural simplicity of the farm and the urban complexity of the hospital. He seemed completely at ease, showing none of the distress that might be expected in such a tense situation. "Tell me about him," Michael said suddenly, pulling up a chair next to Jake. "Tell me about what he's done here." The request wasn't that of a man preparing to reclaim his property, but of someone trying to understand something larger than ownership. Jake started slowly, his artist's eye capturing the details that had made Duke's presence so extraordinary. He spoke about the first day Duke appeared in his hospital room, about Emma's transformation, about Margaret finding her voice again. With each story, Michael's expression softened further. He always had a way of knowing what people needed, Michael reflected, watching Duke gently nuzzle a nervous child who had approached. Back on the farm, he'd stand for hours with sick animals. Never could explain it to the other farmers. They thought I was crazy for letting a donkey act like a nurse. Sarah joined them, sharing the data she'd collected on Duke's impact on patient recovery rates. She explained how his presence had changed not just individual lives, but the entire approach to healing within the hospital. Michael listened intently, his hand never leaving Duke's neck. "When I saw the newspaper article," he continued, "I almost didn't come. Seeing him looking so purposeful, so needed, it made me question everything I thought I knew about what was right." He reached in his jacket and pulled out the ownership papers again, but this time instead of presenting them, he simply looked at them thoughtfully. "The law says he's mine," Michael said slowly, "but the truth is he's found something here that's bigger than ownership. He's not just a farm animal anymore. He's become something else entirely." He turned to Jake, his eyes showing a deep understanding, something I never could have given him. Emma's mother stepped forward, tears in her eyes. "Mr. Reeves," she began. Before Duke visited Emma, she hadn't smiled in weeks. Now she looks forward to every day, even through her treatments. Other patients and family members added their voices, each sharing how Duke had touched their lives. Michael stood up, his decision visible in his stance before he spoke. "I raised Duke," he said, addressing the gathered crowd, "but he's raised himself into something more than I ever imagined possible. It would be wrong to take him away from this." He turned to Jake. He chose this path. He chose you and all of this. Relief washed through the courtyard, but Michael wasn't finished. I do have one condition, he said, causing everyone to hold their breath again. I'd like to be part of this. Not to take him back, but to help. I know Duke, his habits, his needs, his quirks. Maybe that knowledge could help with the therapy program. Sarah's face lit up with professional interest. Actually, we've been looking for someone with animal handling experience to help coordinate the expanded program. Someone who understands both the animals and their therapeutic potential. The tension that had filled the courtyard transformed into something else, possibility. Michael's farm experience combined with his obvious love for Duke could help shape the program's future. It wasn't just a compromise. It was an unexpected perfect solution. Jake reached out his hand to Michael, who took it firmly. Duke brought us both here, Jake said. Maybe that's what he intended all along. Duke pressed his nose against their clasped hands, drawing soft laughter from everyone watching. As the sun set completely over the hospital, casting a warm glow across the scene, the story of Duke, the wandering donkey who had created his own destiny, gained a new chapter. He hadn't just connected patients with healing. He had bridged two worlds, bringing together people who might never have met otherwise. The painting of Duke in the hospital corridor seemed to take on new meaning now. It wasn't just about one animal's impact on a healthcare facility. It was about the mysterious ways that love finds its path, how healing comes in unexpected forms, and how sometimes the truest ownership isn't about legal papers at all. It's about recognizing and honoring the choices made by the heart.